Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 1110. This is your in-depth lecture for week 8 in the semester, and we're going to go ahead and just dive right into things immediately. As always, I apologize for street noise, construction noise, any background noise that you might be getting. Unfortunately, I live on a busy street, and it's just a constant feature of life, and I'm so sorry if it is distracting. So let's go ahead and dive into our slides for the day. I hope that you are doing all right. And this lecture is really designed to get us to start thinking about the primary source analysis and more specifically, oh no, I don't know why it moved ahead. And more specifically to begin thinking about kind of the duration of the semester in terms of core assignments and also the final project that you will eventually be producing at the end of the semester. So this lecture is called Beginning the Primary Source Analysis, and it is of course for week 8. Now on the agenda for today is the discussion board post number 3 prompt, which we'll be walking through the PSA prompt, as well as talking through selecting a viable primary source. As always, of course, our agenda is hyperlinked so that you can move through the slides at whatever pace works best for you. So let's start with the discussion board post number 3 prompt. Now, as I mentioned in the overview lecture, the prompt is different than what you've used for discussion board posts 1 and 2, in that this one is concentrated specifically on preparing you for the PSA. So discussion board post number 3 is due Sunday, July 4th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern to Carmen. July is the last month of the semester that you can utilize the up until the last day of the month hard deadline, meaning that the recommended weekly deadline here is July 4th, but you do have until the last day of July to officially turn this in. I do caution you against doing that for this particular assignment and really the July assignments in general, because they are all scaffolded, which means that they build on each other. Now the prompt reads, to prepare you for writing the primary source analysis, this discussion board post is intended to build towards the second core assignment of the semester. It follows the same form as discussion board posts 1 and 2, but its content is different. The purpose of this discussion board post is to begin thinking about the text you are considering for the core assignments and brainstorm why this text might be a viable primary source. This discussion board post should be a minimum of 250 words and a maximum of 500 words. It should be posted in the discussions tab on Carmen and can take the form of bullet points, a list, sentence clusters, a paragraph, basically any form that is conducive to your thinking and brainstorming. So you can kind of think about this discussion board post as an outline or a sketch. That of course does not mean it needs to be a super formal, kind of totally put together version of a sketch or outline, but the idea here is that it's giving you some space to begin thinking about this PSA before you actually have to go about doing the PSA, okay? So in your discussion board post, I ask that you discuss the following things. What text or texts are you considering for your primary source? Why are you interested in using the text or texts for the remaining core assignments this semester, which would be the primary source analysis and the annotated bibliography? Are you encountering any difficulties when trying to select a text to focus on for the semester? Is the text you are thinking of working with something that was assigned for the class, or is it something that you are bringing in from your own research? So I'll talk about this in more kind of expansive detail when we pivot in a few moments to the PSA prompt. But with the discussion board post, your task is to really begin thinking through what primary source would you want to write about in the PSA, which you will also be focusing on in the annotated bibliography. You do have the option of either selecting something we've already talked about this semester, whether that's one of the zines or a political cartoon or the comics or a poem, or you can bring in something entirely new to work with. You just want to make sure that you're selecting a primary source and not a secondary source. Occasionally students will sometimes pick an article, and that would not necessarily be appropriate for this assignment because you are going to be doing close reading skills that are more conducive to a primary source, okay? So begin thinking about, do you want to perhaps use something that we've already talked about in class, or are you interested in maybe bringing in something we haven't talked about before? What details are you interested in perhaps exploring further in the text or texts you are considering as the primary source? Why might these details be interesting to write about or research? So one of the things you can kind of talk about here is the fact that you might be finding yourself kind of pulled between multiple texts. And by that, I mean, maybe you've narrowed it down to 2 or 3 things that you're interested in, but you haven't determined what exactly you want to write about. So this discussion board post gives you some space to begin thinking about that, as well as it gives you some space to think about what details in or aspects about this text or these texts are you finding could be really interesting to engage with in your primary source analysis, as the PSA really builds on what you did in the concentrated close read of, kind of thinking about critical details that help to make sense of the theme and larger concepts. What concepts or topics from the first 7 weeks of the semester are you interested in potentially learning more about? Is there a way you might incorporate these concepts or topics into your analysis of the text you are thinking of working with? Are there examples of these concepts or topics in the text or text you are potentially selecting as your primary source? So here's where you would begin to think about, of the concepts and topics that we've talked about this semester, what perhaps might be a point of connection or a potential lens through which you could really address and discuss this topic and kind of address this primary source. And then how does this text or text you are looking at relate to or represent Americanness? That is, how are you seeing a connection between the text that might become your primary source and the focus of our course? Now, as a reminder, when you are preparing this project, Americanness does not have to exclusively look like patriotism, military service, the economy, right? As I have been providing you with these various installments each week of readings and viewings, the goal has been to demonstrate that each of these weeks of the semester that we've done so far represents a different facet of Americanness, even though it might be tempting to limit Americanness to only being about patriotism or opinions on national politics, right? All of what we have looked at so far are reflections of what constitutes Americanness, whether that be consumerism or structural oppression or protest or mental health, right? All of these different aspects are parts of a larger whole to think about kind of that pie example we're going with in terms of argumentation. So I do want to really remind you that you're not limited to only working with texts that are explicitly patriotic. You can select something, that is perhaps critical of the US, that perhaps is a bit more abstract, that you're kind of, analyzing or close reading to be connected to Americanness, so on and so forth. Now, in terms of thinking through how to write your discussion board post number 3, I've provided a bit of kind of a map here to try to help you if you're finding yourself a little overwhelmed as to what to talk about. So here I write, first, talk about the text you selected. If you are still deciding between text, explain why you are drawn to multiple options. So it can be really helpful at the beginning of your response to just kind of establish for your reader, here's what I'm thinking about using. Maybe I'm between multiple texts, maybe not, but this is kind of where I'm potentially looking. Next, what is it about this text that is interesting to write about and research? Identify some of the details you might focus on in your analysis. For example, a specific lyric, costumes, facial expressions, or a setting. So here's about kind of zooming in on some of those flash findings a little bit, right? You're moving from establishing what text you're thinking about using to then talking a bit about kind of what elements in this text might be really interesting to analyze and discuss in terms of, kind of your own just analytical lens in this assignment, okay? And it can be really helpful to have a sense going into an essay of what you're thinking of analyzing, because that can really help you to, as you rewatch your text and engage with your text, make sure that you've got enough material to work with. Then I encourage you to review the Google Slides and lectures from the first 9 weeks of, first 8 weeks of the semester, my apologies. Discuss what topics or concepts mentioned in one or multiple lectures that you would like to incorporate into your paper and research. So here you're kind of going back through the Google Slides that you have had from me and the lectures you've had from me up until now. And you're really thinking about, what concepts or weeks in the semester perhaps does this text really fit with? Now, if you're using something that we've already talked about this semester, this makes this task a little bit easier. But if you're finding that you're drawn to working with something brand new, this would kind of give you an opportunity to demonstrate what are the points of connection and kind of shared ground that this text you're thinking about has with things that we've already worked with. And finally, how does the text you chose relate to or represent Americanness? Speculate and argue how you can make a connection between the form and content of your text to the larger theme of our course. So this part of the discussion board post is really about you kind of thinking through or beginning to anticipate how exactly this text is relevant to the larger inquiry we've had this semester about what Americanness is, okay? Now, again, you can kind of write in whatever order feels comfortable to you, but that's my recommended sequencing for this discussion board post to ensure that you're kind of hitting all of the points from the prompt. So let's talk about the PSA prompt. Now, when you look at this document on Carmen, you'll see that it's 2 pages, and I've kind of, screenshotted them for you here so you can see them a little bit further away. And what you'll see is that there's a condensed version and an extended version of the prompt. Now, I do this for the primary source analysis because given that this is a traditional essay, some students, especially since we're in an online context and like I don't get kind of the face-to-face time with you that I would normally get, some students find that having the condensed version of the prompt is easiest for them to make sense of the assignment, whereas other students need a little bit more explanation, which is why I also provide the extended version of the prompt. They're each saying the same thing, but the point here is that if you're looking for a version of the prompt that kind of just gets to the point, the condensed version is going to be your best friend. Whereas if you're kind of looking for a bit more explanation and a little bit more follow through in terms of what different things mean, the extended version of the prompt is going to be your best friend. I encourage students to consult both versions of the prompt, of course, because as I'll kind of demonstrate here, they are very interconnected and intertwined. But again, I understand that different students need different formats for learning. And so this is my attempt to give you two different versions of the prompt to help you make sense of this large assignment as best as possible. So let's kind of look at what each of them contains, okay? And we're gonna kind of go step by step. You'll notice, actually, let me backtrack really quick. Ooh, if it lets me. You'll notice that I kind of have this broken into 4 steps. And so we're going to talk about this prompt by step as opposed to condensed version and then extended version. But when you look at the documents, you'll be able to kind of separate them for your own use. So the primary source analysis is due on July 11th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern to Carmen. Again, you have until the last day of the month in July to turn in this assignment, though I do want to remind you that the annotated bibliography, which is the third and final core assignment, does build on the primary source analysis. And so if you wait until the end of July to turn this assignment in, you won't get feedback from me in time to have kind of useful to you for completing the annotated bibliography, okay? Now, formatting requirements for the PSA are 1-inch margins, 12-point font, Times New Roman, double spaced, 2 to 3 pages, and submitted as a Word document or PDF file. Now, let's kind of go step by step through what the PSA is asking of you. And remember, the PSA is building on what you did in the concentrated close read. It's just asking you to kind of build out the analysis a little bit more. Now, for the primary source analysis, your tasks are as follows. For step 1 is commit to a text. Select a text to focus on in your writing and research this semester. You will write about this text in the remaining core assignments, the primary source analysis, which counts for 200 points, and the annotated bibliography, which counts for 100 points. So it is important that you select a text to work with that you feel you have a lot of interest in, regardless of personal opinion, and that you are comfortable writing about for an extended period of time. So a couple of things here. This is a traditional essay in the sense that you are assessing the argumentation and kind of assessing the ways in which the creator assembles their text to communicate the content through the form. You don't need to select a text to work with that you personally agree with the beliefs of the creator. You don't need to select something that you love or that you hate, right? You have a lot of wiggle room here. What I don't want to see in this paper is I do not want to see you sharing entirely across this assignment your opinion on like the topic that they're presenting, right? What you are selecting this text to do is you're selecting it to write about how they construct their message in the content and in the form. So if you write an opinion paper on the topic that they present, you're not meeting the requirements of the prompt. And so I just want to really flag that for you, that this is not an assignment where you share your personal beliefs and your personal opinions about Americanness. You're selecting a text that you can work with in 2 assignments, and that you're going to really focus on analyzing how they, kind of communicate their message, and you're going to be making a connection from that message and from the form to Americanness at large, okay? Now, here's kind of a little bit more context for this first step. So I write, select a text to focus on for this assignment that you think might represent something about Americanness or might comment on what it means to be made in the USA. So thinking back to our course theme, right? Our course theme is organized around made in the USA and Americanness. And so the primary source that you select needs to be something that you can work with, that you feel has some elements to it that could be representative of Americanness or what it means to be made in the USA, all right? So you want to be able to kind of see some points of connection there. Now, this is the preparation stage of your research process. This text can be any of the following: a music video, a commercial, a movie trailer, an advertisement for a material object, a poster for a movie or TV show, a political poster, an issue of a comic, a single panel comic, a DVD cover, a costume, a board game, a collectible item, a makeup tutorial on YouTube, etc. You can choose something that is part of something larger to write about, such as a specific episode of a TV show, but I strongly advise against choosing something that is longer than that. So I'm asking you to really avoid picking a feature film or an entire album. Now, sometimes students have still chosen to choose a feature film or an album for their primary source. And I want to be really clear here. Every time that a student has selected a feature film or an entire album, they have not done well in the primary source analysis. And the reason for this is because there ends up being so much material to work with that the student gets overwhelmed and ends up summarizing the text and not fulfilling the requirements of the prompt. So please avoid picking something that is really long, that has a lot of material to it, that's going to be too much for you to handle in 2 to 3 pages, okay? The other examples provided here, which, by no means are an exhaustive list, but there's some examples, are texts that would be kind of substantial enough for you to write about without getting overwhelmed by having to address all of the parts, okay? Now, if your text is too big, it may be hard to break it down into smaller pieces to write about. For example, if your text is the entire discography of the singer Halsey, meaning everything that Halsey has ever released, your focus is too broad. If you were to select a specific song or cover art by Halsey as your text, then your focus is narrowed down enough to tackle for the assignment. So this is partially where Miley Cyrus Week comes into effect, right? When you did the concentrated close read, you had to take one text from all of the different texts we looked at for that week and decide which one you were going to focus on. Had you tried to write about absolutely everything in the course of your concentrated close read, it would have been too much material for you to do and still fulfill the requirements of the prompt. Same logic here. Pick one thing to work with if you're looking to a specific artist or a specific brand or whatever it might be, right? Don't be tempted to take on way too much that's going to become a mountain that's going to be kind of hard to actually climb in the course of this assignment. You are welcome to write about anything that we have covered in this class if it's a primary source, but you can also choose something that we have not talked about at all. Keep in mind that you do not have to select a text that you have a strong emotional attachment or reaction to. You may approach selecting your text as simply wanting to know/learn more about whatever it is that you decide on. So some students choose a text because they really enjoy the creator and they find that it would just be sort of more possible for them to do the assignment and be engaged in the assignment if they have a vested interest, even though they have to be cautious of not expressing their personal opinion. Other students find that it's helpful for them to write about something that they really dislike or disagree with, and that even though they're not focusing on their opinions in the course of the assignment, they're more motivated to do the work of close reading and analysis because they have a different kind of interest. Other students prefer to just kind of pick something that they feel they have a lot to say on. Any variation of that is fine. Again, this is not a personal opinion essay though, so you need to be cautious not to be selecting something that you're just going to write about your personal opinions on. So step 1 is picking a text and picking a text that really fits the assignment well. Step 2 is flash findings. As you engage with your text by reading, watching, and/or listening to it, make observations about your text. You will need to pay attention to the text's content and form in the course of your observations. You will also need to gather some basic details about the text's history, such as when it was produced, who made it, and if it is part of a larger project, for example, a song that appears on an album or a poem that is printed in an anthology. This information will be important in giving shape to your discussion of the text's origin, place within US popular culture, and relevance to the time of its release and/or exploration. Okay, so this stage is about doing the kind of focusing work that we've talked about all semester, right? This is where you start to make sure that you're really engaging with your text. You're not just kind of engaging with it in a surface way where you're just summarizing it or kind of skimming it. You should know this text in some respects backwards and forwards, right? You should be able to really kind of be prepared to talk about this text at length, different critical details that you start to notice through your flash findings. And also you'll want to start to gather background information on this because as we'll kind of talk about in terms of, thinking back to the concentrated close read lecture, right? The function of your introduction is in part about giving context and giving background information to make sure that your reader is kind of moving into this text through the same point of entry that you have that makes it more easier for them to follow along with your argument, okay? Now, step 2 is pretty to the point, so you'll notice that the kind of explication here in the extended version of the prompt is pretty similar. Now, it's asking you to observe the appearance of your selected text, and this is the exploratory stage of your research process. Take note of what the text you have selected is, what it looks like, who made it, where it came from, and what details about the text might make it unique or interesting to pay attention to. When was it made? Where was it made? Why was it made? Who was involved in its creation or in its distribution? So this is really the stage where you're gathering those flash findings about the text itself, but you're also making sure that you are really well versed on, its origins, its creator, the kind of, production or background history that makes it come to exist. Step 3 is the notice and focus stage. Identify critical details in this text form and content. So if you remember, flash findings is all about kind of gathering together and in some ways thinking to, sorting the items in your garage and figuring out what buckets or containers are appropriate to sort similar things into. Step 3 is really committing to those critical details and figuring out which of those bins that you've created you really want to commit to exploring in your project. So these are the details that someone needs to pay attention to in order to understand the text argument, why the text was created, and how it appeals to its intended audience. That is your goal in this stage of the writing process, is to move from noticing a lot of details to focusing in on a few specific details that need to close read for the analysis to be thorough and complete. In the course of you noticing and focusing on these details, consider and discuss how the form chosen for the text, for example, the packaging, the visuals, informs how effectively the message or argument is communicated to the consumer. Who appears to be the intended audience? How is the text constructed to appeal to this audience that they feel compelled to connect with or agree with the message or argument? So here's where that interconnectedness comes into play. So if you think back to especially the week that we did comics and zines, and I was kind of asking you, what is the relationship between content and form? You really want to be mindful of this in this particular stage of the PSA kind of prep process. And by that, I mean, you want to really identify what critical details you're going to focus on, much like you did for the concentrated close read. And here you want to be comfortable and confident in being able to discuss, what is this critical details contribution to the larger text? And kind of beyond that, how is this critical detail being designed or constructed so that it will appeal to or be legible to its intended audience, okay? Now, in terms of the explication we have here for step 3, sorry, my computer's being so weird. Notice significant details about your text and focus on why they could be important to understanding what this text is and the message or argument it is conveying to its intended audience. So this is the identifying and tracking stage of your research process. Take note of what stands out about your text. Why did this person or the creative team that created this text decide to put certain details, visuals, sounds, or objects into your text? What do these details, visuals, sounds, or objects accomplish by being part of the text? How does the format give shape to the content? That is, to what extent does the format chosen for the text inform how effective the text is in communicating the text message and or argument? Consider if certain sensory responses may be being appealed to or distorted by your text and why this might be intentionally done. Who might this intended consumer be, and how perhaps are these significant details an attempt to appeal to or distort this consumer's expectations? Perhaps your chosen text incorporates a cityscape into the setting, or maybe it is a text that could be identified as part of the mediascape. Perhaps your text uses costumes or objects from a particular decade, like clothing from the 1950s, or recognizable commodities like Campbell's chicken noodle soup from the 1960s. Maybe it takes place in a specific geographical location, like the Midwest. How might these kinds of choices suggest who the intended consumer is, or why other details are included in the video? Now, if you kind of remember in my discussions about the concentrated close read and comparing kind of the writing and argumentation process as being similar to baking a pie, if you think back to your pie slices, in some respects, step 3 is about your pie filling, right? The scope, the extent to which you analyze and engage with these critical details is going to result in and culminate in a more thorough and kind of hearty pie filling, for lack of a better word. And so what I'm getting at here is when you are doing your close readings of the critical details you choose to focus on, you really want to be thoughtful about kind of identifying what is their usefulness, what is their function, right? How are they contributing to this larger text? And in doing so, and thinking about different form elements, whether that's color scheme or costuming or whatever, right? How are they effectively or not assisting the creator in communicating their message, right? So thinking back to kind of the Marie and Worrywart comic, for example, what a lot of you kind of focused on the color red and its significance to, how Jen Woodall was, communicating a narrative and an argument about anxiety, and just kind of how anxiety can be, all encompassing and just kind of take over the individual person's life and just like everything around them, right? And it can just be kind of this gradual overtaking process. That would be an example of thinking about kind of what is the function of the color red and what is the use of it, allowing the creator to show or do that relates to the messaging, okay? So if you're struggling in this stage, I, of course, am happy to work with you one-on-one, but I also want to mention that as you're getting feedback from me, on your discussion board posts and on your process posts, it's very helpful to kind of revisit some of that feedback to see if you're already doing this work in a sophisticated and significant way, right? And then finally, step 4 is about making connections. Identify the critical details in this text that demonstrate its relevance to the Made in the USA theme of our course. How does the text that you selected expose, demonstrate, or comment on how Americanness is defined, represented, or limiting? Put another way, how does the text that you selected relate to the concepts or ideas we have explored in this course related to Americanness? Keep in mind that you will need to produce a definition for what Americanness is in the course of forming your argument. For the purposes of the primary source analysis, you will need to make a confident, compelling argument about how the text relates to Americanness. All right, so what this is getting at here is that you want your analysis to build towards a larger discussion of how does this text fit into this conversation we've been having about these various facets of Americanness, right? If you recall, we are focusing on how pop culture allows us to talk about some of these different topics and issues because of how they're represented in pop culture that perhaps, make space for us to have certain conversations that we might not otherwise have. They're perhaps representing things or people in ways that they're not typically represented, right? So you want to really think about and build your paper toward a discussion of, why is this text that you selected as your primary source useful when thinking about and talking about and analyzing what comprises Americanness, okay? And you want to make sure that your essay is argumentative, meaning that you are going to, in the course of your close readings, indeed be, analyzing and assessing and evaluating the effectiveness of the critical details you've selected in conveying the creator's argument, while also making a compelling argument about how this text you've chosen really reflects and is representative of kind of Americanness. And one way to approach that would be to use some of the concepts we've used this semester as a way of explaining how we can identify Americanness at work, okay? And then in the explication for step 4, I say, ask what these significant details could mean about your text's role in what it is within US capitalism, or about how this text is representing / commenting on Americanness. So some students find that talking about capitalism is the easiest way for them to really approach this kind of larger container term of Americanness. Other students have found that kind of breaking down Americanness into different pieces works for them, all of which is fine. But this is the speculation stage of your research process where you transition into producing a confident argument. Here you are taking the significant details that you have identified and are considering how you can begin to draw possible conclusions as to what these details represent or mean. Consider how these significant details that you identified might tell us something about what your text's purpose or function is within capitalism. Think specifically about how the text's appearance, structure, genre, sound, manufacturer, etc., might inform its reason for existing or what it is being used to do. You might consider if your text is selling a product or a service to a consumer for a manufacturer's financial gain, or how your text might be commenting on a social issue or injustice occurring in the United States. If it is not selling or commenting on something, what else might it be doing or representing, okay? So this is the kind of like cliche question of like, why does this matter? Why is this significant? What's the point of caring about this thing, right? So this is really where you have an opportunity to address how this text fits into a larger whole, which is kind of Americanness as that larger pie, okay? So that kind of takes us through that prompt. I'm gonna pause here for a moment to get some water, and then in a second on your side of things, we will transition to kind of talking about how exactly you can approach selecting a viable primary source. Hello, everyone. I am back. Very quick on your side of things, a little bit longer on my side of things. So let's talk about selecting a viable primary source, okay? Which, if you recall, is the first step of this primary source analysis that you've got to put together. So as a reminder, just some terms that you'll see kind of show up in the prompt, but that also might be helpful to you as you construct your analysis. US capitalism is an economic and political system in the United States that is for profit and based on competition in the market, wage labor, and private ownership. So if there are facets to capitalism that you feel you could kind of work with as a way of talking about Americanness, this would be one opportunity or kind of way into doing that analytical work. Now, the consumer, once again, is a person who purchases goods or services based on need or desire. So you'll notice in the prompt that I kind of talk about individuals as consumers. You can also make that choice. You might also refrain from using the term consumer, but it also might be a way of thinking about the kind of relationship between the text you're writing about and the audience, potentially if they're purchasing it, right? They're using it, they're subscribing to it, et cetera, et cetera. And then as a reminder, the commodity is an item that is produced by a corporation, business, or individual and is sold to a consumer. The commodity can fill a need or satisfy a desire. And once again, commodities are kind of, things that really fulfill that competition aspect of capitalism, in that when you go to Target or Aldi or Kroger, right, you have all of these different kind of store options, and within them you have countless options of, different brands, different ingredients, different designs, different packaging about, the same good or service, right? You have so many different options within just one shelf. You go to Target and decide that you're going to buy soap, you've got like 50 options, right? And that's kind of what this commodity exists to do, right? It can definitely fill a need that you have, but it can also satisfy a desire, especially if you're someone maybe who enjoys like home decor. There's different levels to which the commodity can be arguably the same thing, but its design is going to be what really kind of furthers its effectiveness in being purchased by the consumer within capitalism. Now let's talk about tips for selecting your primary source. You're going to want to select something that you are interested in, that you can research more about, that relates to the topics we have discussed in class, and that is limited enough in scope that it's not too big. Now, this might feel like a really overwhelming list of like, how do I possibly find something that like does all of these things? But the idea here is that you want to make sure that you're interested enough in this thing that you're not going to be bored out of your mind. That is a common challenge I find for students. As I mentioned before, I know that for a lot of you, English 1110 is not a class that you necessarily were excited to take or wanted to take. It does, of course, fall under the GE category. And so I am very aware that for some or many of you, it can be really challenging to feel excited about the work that we're doing. And so for that reason, I really implore you to give some thought about what primary source you want to work with, because the worst thing is when students come to me and say, oh, I just didn't think it would matter if it mattered to me or not. And now I'm just so miserable because I'm having to write, multiple assignments about the same thing. So it does really go a long way. And again, interest doesn't have to be about liking something or agreeing with something. It can just be a matter of like, all right, I feel motivated to work on this assignment, okay? And you also want to really pick something that, you feel like you can kind of do more research on, as that's what the annotated bibliography is going to ask of you to do. But more on that later. Now, please note that you do not need to select something that has America or US in the title, or that explicitly represents patriotism or nationalism. These are options of some topics and concepts that might be helpful to start with as you begin thinking about possible primary sources, but you are by no means required to center patriotism or positive feelings about and associations with the US in your writing and research. Depending on your interests, it may be more productive to examine social commentaries, pop culture criticisms, or narratives by and about marginalized people. And marginalized people, could be queer folks, it could be people of color, it could be disabled folks, it could be a number of different things, right? It could be folks who don't have citizenship status privilege, right? Tons of different opportunities. You don't need to, kind of feel like you have to squeeze your analysis under just America or US. Sometimes I find that students think that their text has to have those words in the title. It does not. It can really be anything that you find is helpful for exploring a, facet or side of Americanness. So in looking at kind of some of these examples here, I provided a, kind of an example of the types of text that might be useful to work with if you are someone who prefers a static image, which means, you don't want to work with a music video, you don't want to work with an episode, you want to work with, something that kind of is, not a moving image and is just going to be kind of a straightforward single thing. So one example you might consider would be a US poster designed to advertise buying war bonds and supporting the country's involvement in World War II. Now, of course, if you wanted to work with a US poster or, propaganda or a photograph or any of those things, it doesn't have to be on this topic, but this is one example of what you could think about. Now, a tip I provide for you here is that you might find that what you want to work with is one of many examples of this kind of text. So for example, there's going to be many examples that you could work with if you wanted to talk about kind of posters that promoted war bonds in World War II. And so you want to avoid the temptation of trying to work with a broad category like World War II war bond posters, and instead focus on one specific example of this kind of text. Trying to work with a series or broad category of text will become too broad and chaotic for the scope of this project. So if you decided you wanted to work with a political poster, you don't want to necessarily try to write about 5 or 6 of them or even 2 of them. You'd want to pick one of them. Okay. So for example, in the past, when students have wanted to work with this kind of image, I've encouraged them to really think about, what does their static image provide them with that they could potentially write about as critical details. So if somebody wanted to write about this war bond poster on the right side here, they might think about the Nazi symbol that's in the background. They might think about the significance of the American flag being held up by one of the children, that there are 3 children in the image, right? That you have kind of this subcaption of "Don't let that shadow touch them" by war bonds. And just kind of thinking about these different layers to how this poster is trying to appeal to an intended audience at a specific moment in time. So this political poster, for example, has a really clear-cut way in which context could be talked about, clear critical details that could be used, and really maps nicely onto Americanness. Same goes for the political poster on the left side, where it says, "If you can't go across, come across," by war bonds, and is definitely focusing more so on kind of military service and the duties and obligations of people who are not serving kind of the US in some sort of military or Navy capacity. What can they do that allows them to support them? In this case, it would sort of follow the logic of buying war bonds. Okay, so these are just kind of 2 examples, especially for folks who might be interested in a historical project. That might be an ideal option. Another option would be an advertisement. For example, here I pulled one from a magazine in the 1950s and 1960s that encourages housewives to buy a specific product. On the right side, we see that it says "beautiful, clear, pearl white complexion or money back." This would be an option of if you're interested in how, makeup advertisements communicated certain ideas about whiteness, about beauty ideals, how movie stars were incorporated into these ads even before they really kind of hit their peak in the 1970s, right? That would be one kind of example. Or to the left where she says, in this ad, "I knew that mother and grandmother used it for their cold starching, but I never dreamed that more than 1 million women have found it the easiest way in the world to do hot starching. My ironings are lovely now." And of course, we see the use of a speech bubble here. And we have an illustration of a woman as opposed to, kind of an actual person in the advertisement. So if you are interested in kind of animation or illustration and its role in contributing to advertising effectiveness, this might also be the kind of example you could think to. And these examples that I'm providing here, again, are not to say that you have to use these specific advertisements, but are kinds of samples of the types of advertisements you might find would be useful to look to. I provide a few more examples here, along with the tip that when selecting your primary source, avoid choosing a group or series of texts. And again, that kind of reiterates the same messaging as what I said about the political posters. For example, if you are interested in print advertisements from the 1950s and 1960s in the United States that had an intended audience of suburban housewives, select one example. Trying to write about a few different ones is too broad for this assignment, okay? And, I think this particular area of kind of thing that you could write about is especially robust because, especially in the 1950s and 60s, you find that kind of the housewife was the targeted demographic for many print advertisements, especially print advertisements that were focused on moving pots, pans, food items, cleaning products, right? Because that was sort of the head of household in regards to consumption. Another primary source example you could think about would be a specific art piece, such as Andy Warhol's Campbell's soup cans from 1961 to 1962. We, of course, got a little bit of a glance at the kind of relevance of the Campbell's soup cans in the pop art entry we looked at from the MoMA Learning website. But definitely you could focus on an art piece. It doesn't have to be pre-2000s. If you follow an Instagram page and they do art that you really enjoy and there's a particular post that you would want to write about, that is also totally fine as well. But you could also think about artwork as being an option, especially because some of the terminology we used in terms of kind of comics and zines could be relevant here. One tip I want to offer, though, is to avoid making your selection, once again, too broad or too big. If you are interested in the art of someone like Andy Warhol, let's say, select one of his pieces as your primary source rather than trying to write about everything he ever created. The same goes for the subject of his works. If you're interested in Marilyn Monroe and how she is represented in his art, make sure that you limit the scope of your project to how she appears in his art, not the trajectory of her entire life and career. So hopefully this is feeling on some level repetitive, which of course works beautifully within the scope of pop art, but hopefully this is feeling repetitive in terms of you're seeing a pattern here. Don't pick too broad, don't pick too much, limit the focus, and kind of, again, think back to Miley Cyrus Week and that process you had to do of you've reviewed all of these different texts and then you ultimately had to select one to write about. Same exact research process that you are practicing here. Now, perhaps you were interested in, something like, and I gotta move my share screen thing so I can see my own caption, in selecting a beauty YouTuber like I Love Sarai, Karen Sarai Gonzalez, or, James Charles. Some students have elected to write about beauty YouTubers or even just YouTubers in general who have been canceled or who have created successful side businesses from being a social media influencer. That is totally fine if you'd like to pursue that. But I want to, again, kind of encourage you to think through how you're approaching the topic. So a do for this would be to select a creator-specific video, tutorial, or product as your primary source. A don't here would be to select the YouTuber's entire career as your primary source, because that's just far too much material to work with, right? You want to be really selective about if you're interested in talking about the cancellation of a particular creator, or if you're interested in talking about kind of the importance of visibility for women of color in particular spaces in social media, right? You want to really be kind of pointing to a specific video as a representative or as a kind of, key example of this being in effect, as opposed to trying to write about absolutely everything, because that's where summarizing starts to happen. Another example of a strong primary source would be if you wanted to write about a material object. For example, if you were interested in kind of beauty gurus online, maybe you wanted to write about the Jackie Aina eyeshadow palette from Anastasia Beverly Hills. But an example of a weak primary source would be trying to write about every makeup tutorial that Jackie Aina has ever uploaded to YouTube, right? And again, trying to kind of write about Jackie Aina as a person, you'd want to really ground this analysis in something specific. So some students have elected to write about products or merch released by creators online as one way that they kind of talk about the evolution of consumerism or agency or visibility in regards to Americanness. Another example of a strong primary source, thinking back to kind of canceled creators, might be something like Jeffree Star's Doing What's Right 2020 video, or an example of a weak primary source would be trying to talk about the history of Jeffree Star cosmetics. You'll notice kind of a pattern here that I provide a lot of examples here related to social media, in part because, again, thinking back to kind of what we talked about at the beginning of the semester, sometimes it can be tempting to excuse social media from the rest of mainstream media as if it does not interact with and engage with the rest of what's happening across popular culture. But you are more than welcome to select a text from social media if you find that it will really help you to explore perhaps what Americanness looks like in 2021, if it helps you to explore a particular moment, maybe in the 2010s, right? But the idea here is that you have a lot of wiggle room if you choose not to just, kind of select something we've already worked with this semester. You have a lot of wiggle room in terms of thinking through how you might like to approach talking about Americanness and popular culture. And again, you don't have to love someone or, hate someone to kind of make a deciding decision, make a formal decision about what primary source you're working with. Another example of a strong primary source might be Madonna's Material Girl music video from 1984, whereas an example of a weak primary source would be the entire Like a Virgin album. So again, thinking back to the Halsey example from the prompt, You want to be really cautious about if there's a creator that you really love or you're interested in kind of their impact on a particular decade or year. You want to be really selective about, choosing one music video or one single, as opposed to trying to write about the entire album or project. Another example of a strong primary source might be thinking about kind of structural oppression or kind of internet bias, or just any variety of things that you might see on the internet that kind of make it so that certain creators move to the top of the platform or experience more success on a platform as opposed to other creators. So one example might be thinking about kind of the ongoing discussions about the kind of original Renegade, and just kind of how Black creators on TikTok don't necessarily get the recognition and credit that they always deserve, which of course has led to the current kind of strike that we're seeing happen. And of course, discussions that are happening here about kind of how that might impact things like Megan Thee Stallion's single for Thought Shit, and just kind of how different songs might suffer on the charts if they don't have dances accompanied with them on TikTok, right? That would be kind of an opportunity to think about, what is the significance or relevance of, a particular dance video or a particular TikTok trend or whatever it might be that's allowing for something larger to be explored about Americanness. Another topic that sometimes students have liked to explore is how vlogging or just, posting, lifestyle content online has allowed folks to feel like they are experiencing a parasocial relationship with creators, but also how these different kinds of texts perhaps allow us to talk about consumerism or talk about kind of aspirational narratives in different ways. But examples of a weak primary source would be something like, why TikTok is better than YouTube, right? Trying to compare one platform to another would be far too broad and too big for a project of this nature. And so whereas that kind of information might be relevant in the context section of your paper, you want to be cautious about not trying to do kind of a compare contrast in that type of way, which is similar to, trying to propose something like Hype House versus Team 10, and just kind of past trends we've seen about social media content creation. We'd want to be really cautious about not taking on way too much compared to the scope of the actual paper, okay? And then other examples of potential primary sources to maybe think through, again, would be kind of different social media movements. If you kind of come across something that you feel like there's a concrete video or image you could point to that would allow you to talk about, a larger movement or issue, that would be a great topic to select. If there is a, comics creator or artist on Instagram, let's say, who you really enjoy and you want to select one post from them, that would be a great option to go with. If you listen to podcasts and there's a specific episode of a podcast that you find would be really helpful to exploring Americanness, that would be great. You can, of course, select a music video. You can select a material object like a board game or a makeup product, or, it could be a poster. Again, it could be a YouTube video of some kind, whether it's a tutorial or it's a haul or whatever it might be. It could be that you're interested in something that we've kind of talked about tangentially, like the Free Britney movement. We've kind of, glazed over the surface a little bit. We've obviously have seen kind of developments in the Britney Spears conservatorship legally in the last few weeks in terms of how people are talking about it. If you're interested in that, it might be something we're returning to writing about Lucky and connecting it to the Free Britney movement. Might be something that is interesting, as increasingly folks are kind of thinking through some of those points of comparison. If you're a reality TV show fan, maybe you watch The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, you can definitely write about one of those shows and talk about how they represent something related to Americanness. You need to make sure that you're writing about only one episode and not an entire season, right? And then finally, maybe something like Demi Lovato's coming out video where they talk about being non-binary and using they, them pronouns. If there are kind of particularly visible moments in, pop culture representations of marginalized people that you're interested in, that might also be another opportunity as well. Okay, so that is everything that I have for you today in English 1110. I hope that this was helpful for thinking through this massive assignment called the primary source analysis, which of course you do have 2 weeks to really think through. Now, of course, you do have up until the last day of July to kind of officially and formally turn it in, but I do strongly encourage you to try to get that primary source analysis done and submitted before you work on the annotated bibliography, because since the assignments scaffold on each other, if I get all the assignments at once, it kind of eliminates the possibility of getting feedback from me, which, depending on how you're navigating, summer school, that might be fine. And I will not judge you if you're not looking for that feedback in advance of doing the annotated bibliography, but just something to think about as you organize your work plan for the rest of the month. All right. So I will talk to you again soon. Thank you for tuning in with me and have a good rest of your day. Bye.